Yawascano. I'm thankful you are well. My name is John Oates Bowen. I am a member of the G20 Interfaith Forum Anti-Racism Initiative and a citizen of the Seneca Nation, an indigenous nation located in New York State. I will act as the moderator for the webinar, which centers on the spiritual exploration of possible pathways to providing energy security for all. At this time, I would like to welcome all of you to today's panel discussion hosted by the G20 Interfaith Forum in conjunction with the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation. The G20 Interfaith Forum advocates for global solutions by collaborating with religious thought leaders and political representatives to help shape the overall G20 agenda. The International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation focuses on charting new pathways toward peace, equality, justice, and a healthy, sustainable world through collaboration amongst people of diverse cultures and faith traditions. The aims of this webinar are to explore the spiritual aspects of embedded racial disparities found throughout the production, governance, and impacts of global energy systems, continued colonial patterns stemming from energy transitions when Indigenous rights, sacred lands, and historical trauma are often ignored, and the ways in which faith shapes people's understanding of obligation, restraint, and the common good in terms of energy production, use, and expansion. As a faith keeper of our ceremonies, our Haudenosaunee way of life, my views on energy expansion are rooted in our Ganonyo, our words of thanksgiving offered before every gathering, which mandates a duty of gratitude, reciprocity, and stewardship of our Mother Earth. If mindful of our teachings, the leaders of our Haudenosaunee nations, including the Seneca Nation, should make decisions regarding energy by first evaluating how those decisions would impact the land, the water, and the generations yet to come. However, our Indigenous governments are often ignored when energy expansion in our ancestral homelands occurs. Energy production decisions made by non-Haudenosaunee governing bodies have negatively impacted many Haudenosaunee communities. For example, in West Valley, New York, in the ancestral homelands of the Seneca Nation, a commercial nuclear fuel reprocessing facility extracted uranium and plutonium from spent nuclear fuel, which left behind millions of gallons of high-level liquid waste and led to widespread radioactive and hazardous chemical contamination. The West Valley site was used to bury commercial and atomic weapons waste in trenches. These trenches eventually filled with water, overflowed, and caused radioactive runoff into surrounding streams. Energy decisions made by non-Indigenous governing bodies violated Haudenosaunee spiritual teachings, requiring us to seriously evaluate any potential danger to the earth. We are her caretakers. We are taught that she is our mother and that we should cherish her. If she is healthy, then we also experience well-being. Unfortunately, our voice is often ignored or completely overlooked. Based on the spiritual teachings of our ceremonies, including the Ganonyok, I implore humanity to find ways to expand energy resources for all in ways that allow the earth to remain healthy. At some point, she will grow old and die, whether biologically or geologically. But planets do die. But humanity can certainly keep her as healthy as possible. Given our ever-growing energy needs, there are certainly ways to do so. However, this is just one aspect of the spiritual exploration of possible pathways for providing energy security for all. At this point in time, I would like to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Aisake Casimira, the Dean of Strategic Visioning at the Pacifica Communities University in Suva, Fuji. Our second panelist is Fletcher Harper, an Episcopal priest and the Executive Director of Green Faith, an international interfaith environmental organization. Our third panelist is Tariq El-Olimi, the co-founder of Future Faith, a nonprofit that mobilizes the wisdom of faith and spiritual traditions to reshape climate and biodiversity action. Our fourth panelist is Sima Lebert, a Namibian development practitioner and human rights activist. For more information about our beautiful panelists, please refer to the chat box. Before my fellow panelists begin, I just want to remind everyone that this webinar aims to explore the spiritual aspects of embedded racial disparities found throughout the production, governance, and impacts of global energy systems, continued colonial patterns stemming from energy transitions when Indigenous rights, sacred lands, and historical trauma are ignored, and the ways in which faith shapes people's understanding of obligation, restraint, and the common good in terms of energy production, use, and expansion. One last item I find very important is to remind us all that these challenging topics will stir emotions that perhaps are quite passionate. These are very heavy topics to address, so we must do our best to be respectful of one another and mindful that people might have views that differ from our own. Just a quick note for our attendees. If you have a question you would like to ask at some point in the future, you will click on the Q&A feature, which will be at the bottom of the screen to submit your inquiry. We do ask, once the Q&A box is open, that you direct your question to one of the panelists specifically to minimize confusion and to make a shorter delayed response time. However, the Q&A feature might not be activated until the panelists are close to completing their presentations. Be on the lookout for this feature. At this point in time, Aisaki Casimira, you now have 9 minutes to share your thoughts.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Well, at least good morning from my part of the world. Thank you for the organizers and the moderator for the introduction. At least we're here. My sharing with you this morning is particularly on this topic, a whole of life spirituality of 3 idioms. And I'll go through that in the next 8 to 7 minutes. Sharing with you these particular slides as a guideline for our discussion this morning, but also later on. This quotation is from one of our church leaders. He is the president of the church in Tahiti, and he said this earlier this year. But this was in reference to a whole lot of things, but in particular in relation to how development had saved the Pacifica region for the last almost a century. And so this quotation is from him, and he said, "The crisis is not only political or economic, it is also narrative. And as we had all the experience, many of our peoples have been educated in stories that are not of their own. We were taught to see development, progress, leadership, and even religion through lenses formed elsewhere. And the result is not only about physical climate change and economic inequality, but also cultural dislocation and spiritual weakening that challenge us." And so the 2 questions he posed within that paragraph were, who tells us who we are and whose story shapes our future? I added those three bullet points to highlight the importance of this discussion today or this morning. Narratives not of our own. We need the need for new narratives to shape our world and our development, and the need for a spirituality that honors our place in the universe. But I'm particularly bringing those thoughts because it's energy, the discussion of energy, while it's specifically focused, my question is, why is spirituality a pathway, and in the case of G20, an optional pathway, when most Pacifica indigenous peoples, and I'm assuming that elsewhere around the world, spirituality and how they see life is the mainstay of their own life. It's not an option or a pathway. And so is energy. The pathway to sharing energy is not merely spiritual in that sense, that spirituality is just one of the pathways as technology is. So those are, for me, questions that I have with regards to the shape of the agenda of this particular panel. Move to the second slide, and this is where I'm talking about the three idioms in a proverb. This is taken from my own dialect, and io si rere, io si vastam, io si lalonga. But this is particularly it's usually a proverb that is used in the installation of a chief, used in the protocol of a child's first haircut, a child's first 1-year birthday. Not necessarily is the Western style of celebration of birthdays. A young man or a young woman's initiation as teenagers. And so this particular proverb is used in those areas of life, but they also used in everyday language to remind someone of his or her place in the community or in the village. But when used in protocols, it's to remember that you are but just a part of the universe. It places the human being not necessarily as the pinnacle, as the center of the universe, but part of it. So for us, it is a very much a part of what is understood here at the university as the whole of life philosophy of life. And it gives you a brief description of what that philosophy is about. It is a non-eliminative approach that aims at navigating and reweaving with love the different dimensions of a complex yet unified whole of life, once severed by the coloniality. It is about distinguishing without separation, diversifying without estrangement, and embracing the parts without compromising the whole. It is about an ongoing reaffirmation of our unique differences, even in the occasion where these may appear contradictory and contrary to our foundational beliefs. Our people in Pacifica has been practicing this whole of life vision through what is called a va. In Fiji, it's called a sautu. In other places in the Pacific, their own unique names. Let me go through quickly the three idioms in the proverb, and to tell a little more deeply into each of the idioms. The first one is io si rere. It simply means always look up. And stories were told when we were young, lying on the mat with our grandmothers, usually with our grandfathers, or usually our grandmothers, who are the holders of our wisdom knowledge. And we always asked to face up and look up in the sky. And as he tells the stories about where we come from, our ancestral mounds, our spirituality, our focus is always up. But it's also, it means this, that our universe is cosmic. And our ecology is not just here on this earth, in this world, but our ecology is also part of a wider world, a universe that is, we are simply a part of it. And the ecosystem of a cosmic world is made up of the stars and the moon and beyond the stars and the moon and the sun. And for us to be constantly aware that we need to cultivate cosmic values. It brings about the wonder and significance of being human, yet we are only the living being in this vastness of this cosmic world, universe, that has consciousness, meaning that we are gifted in the terms of human beings, we are gifted in this vastness of this universe with consciousness. And we're still trying to debate what is consciousness and to find out its meaning today. And it has been a long journey. But the simple fact is that because we are consciousness, we have the gift of consciousness, we're going to have a significant contribution to make at a particular place in a particular corner of our world. And so that is particularly in means of Yossi Rere, always look up. The next one, this next idiom is Yossi Vaste, always look out. It's about our care of responsibility and care, not only about the human ecology, but also out there in the sea, in the what's in the forest, in the land, and all that kind. And it's shaped by that ecological spirituality. The first one, in terms of Yossi Rere, is the cosmic spirituality. Now, and the second one, the second idiom, is about spirituality that is ecological. And the third one is Yossi Lalonga, to always look inside ourselves as human beings, not in terms of the human ecology, but in terms of what is the universe within each person, the biology of each person. And so the three idioms for that is in the proverb, and for us, the human spirituality. And so in the three idioms, there is spirituality of ecology, the human spirituality, and the cosmic spirituality. Not that these three things, spiritualities, are separate, but it gives you three dimensions of spirituality as we understood them. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Yahweh Kasi, for sharing those beautiful words with us today. One thing that is so important is to remember that we are just a part of the universe, just a small part. But the sad part of it all is sometimes we can cause a lot of damage, although we are just a small part. So hopefully we can take these words of wisdom to remind us that we should always incorporate thoughts toward the ecology of not just humans, but the animals, the waters, the universe itself, and even our internal cosmos, when we make decisions regarding energy, so that we could all be healthy and happy. At this time, I would like to let Fletcher Harper have 9 minutes to share his thoughts with us.
Thanks so much, Janos. And I couldn't be happier than to follow Dr. Casimira, because what I'm going to talk about, I hope, represents a practical case study of seeking to put into action the values that he so beautifully described. I lead an organization called Green Faith, which today works with diverse faith leaders in 13 countries across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas to campaign for climate justice. But we started our energy journey and our clean energy journey in New Jersey, where about 20 years ago, we found there were a number of people who, from diverse religious traditions, who were having the awakening to the values that Dr. Casimira described. And so through a combination of efforts, we worked with the state government, with a number of solar developers, with financial institutions, to secure the resources and the means of facilitating the installation of solar arrays on 25 different religious facilities around the state. And this was the first time that this kind of project had taken place. And we found that the effect on people was quite profound. You know, you've got the solar panels, but you see here a Catholic priest and the congregation, as a way of celebrating the installation of the panels, had rented a piece of equipment so that they could bless it in their full Catholic style. And this sort of spirit, this infectious spirit of enthusiasm around energy sourced in a more ethical manner, was really infectious and led to work that we did with a significant number of religious communities and networks around the United States. That enthusiasm built towards the next stage of our journey, which is that how could we not only work with religious institutions so that they could host solar installations, but how could we work with them so that they could become facilitators of a similar kind of ethically, spiritually driven commitment to energy justice for their communities and their members? So for the better part of 2 years, we had a project through which over 100 different households across the state of New Jersey went solar, because the religious institutions that we were working with hosted solar socializing events where people could learn more about the technology, learn how they could get it installed themselves, and connect with solar developers who were interested in working at the household level. And there are a lot of details about the way these projects happen that we learned a great deal from, in terms of the level of care and commitment to education and awareness raising that really both can and must be a part of this kind of effort. So in the meantime, we're transitioning from working just in New Jersey to working nationally across the United States and to working internationally. And as Janos has mentioned, these issues of racism and of colonialism, and we would add to that discrimination against women, very quickly rise to the front when one is looking at the overall landscape, both of who is hurt worst by climate change and by the way that current energy systems function. And secondly, how the clean energy transition works or doesn't work. And so we helped found an initiative based in Africa called SHINE. And I'm going to share a little bit about this. SHINE is designed, and it's now under the leadership of Mela Chipandia, and it is about powering change and centering women. And it works at the intersection of climate change, because the research could not be more clear that women, particularly women in economically underinvested situations, suffer the worst impacts of climate change, and also are most likely to suffer lack of access to modern forms of energy, period. And when communities lack access to adequate energy, there are all kinds of harms to education, to healthcare, to livelihoods, to security and safety, and so forth. And so the SHINE collaboration remains and is now a thriving effort, working largely but not exclusively in sub-Saharan Africa, to aim to bridge this gap between issues of climate and energy access and gender. And just to show one page from the website here, SHINE is working now in a dozen African countries and is providing support, both in terms of technical support and modest level of financial support, to women-led renewable energy initiatives that have so far empowered and more than 1,000 women who are working on these efforts, and countless communities. What we see over and over again is that governments, policymakers do not adequately understand the issues that underlie the energy access crisis and the different racial and gender and economic dimensions to that they assume that the only kinds of energy solutions that are available or workable are solutions that operate at the very large international corporate level. And they miss what is sitting right in front of them, which is that around the world, there are dozens and dozens and dozens and hundreds of locally community-owned and led, women-owned and led renewable energy enterprises that are ready to scale and that simply need just access to financing at non-extractive levels of interest in order to thrive. So the message here is that we found that there's a clear positive future that's available. The final step of our journey has been back to the movement arena, because we believe that what is needed now is a clear global movement calling for and demanding an energy future that represents the values that we're talking about today. The Sunday was a first pilot mobilization that took place just in the US last September to promote renewable energy and these related values. We're looking at now creating a next global day of action in June of 2027. And we thoroughly believe that religious and spiritual communities have an essential role to play in amplifying these values and calling for a future that's absolutely possible and that represents the values to which we're all deeply committed.
I thank you, Fletcher, for sharing your perspective and for enlightening me on the impact that the current energy system setup has on women. I never thought about that so deeply before. I mean, I tend to focus on Indigenous rights in general, but it was a very good reminder that women actually suffer a big brunt of the energy crisis if they live in economically disadvantaged communities. But yet at the same time, you also told us that they also bring the most, they can also bring very open and great ideas to help us solve that problem. So that is very encouraging to know that there are organizations out there trying to empower women so that they can have energy access and access to health and all those things that go with it, but also to help empower them to make solutions to this very deep and serious issue. At this time, I would like to turn the floor over to Tarek Al-Olimi, who now has 9 minutes to share his thoughts with us.
Thank you very much, Jano. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Peace and greetings to all of you from Bahrain. Also a pleasure and a privilege to follow Reverend Fletcher, who had the blessing of meeting as he gathered a interfaith congregation for the launch of Laudato Si at the dearly missed and beloved Pope Francis. So thank you, Fletcher, for all your work here in the world. I want to start with maybe a very simple premise, which is if you are someone who has access to Zoom, I'll assume tonight that all of you will do the same thing. You will reach for a light switch. And hidden inside that very tiny gesture is probably everything that we're wrestling with today. Who has light and who does not? What it costs and who pays and at what consequence? And I use this example because in so many ways we are living through a crisis of the invisible. The carbon accumulating in our atmosphere has no color. The methane leaking from our wells and pipelines has no smell. The energy that may be most invisible is all. And so many of us will not stop when we remember to turn that light switch on, where that light comes from, whose hands pulled it from the earth, whose lungs filled it with smoke to make it. Now, for hundreds of millions of people, of course, that invisibility runs the other way. If you live beside a coal plant, you'll see it on your windowsill. You'll taste the air. The map of who gets energy and who gets smoke still follows the old maps of race and empire. And invisibility, as we know, is a privilege of distance. And meanwhile, we fight wars over ancient sunlight buried in the ground. Now, this invisible is not unreal, yet we have built an economy that destroys exactly what we cannot see and optimizes only for what we can measure. And this is where I think the perspective of this webinar is incredibly important towards a pathway towards solutions, because faith and spiritual traditions have spent millennia generating commitment to what cannot be seen, to ancestors and to descendants, to the divine, the sacred within all things. This is the very skill spiritual communities are set up to do. They're institutions built for engaging the invisible in all these sacred and miraculous ways. And to go to my own Islamic tradition, we give this commitment, this skill, a name. It is called Al-Mizan, which translates into Arabic literally as the balance. The Holy and Blessed Quran says that God raised the heavens and established a balance with a double command: do not transgress the balance and also weigh it with justice. And when we notice that this balance is one balance, not two, it shows that the same equilibrium that holds the planets, the galaxies, the stars that orbit this is the same balance that holds the climate steady and holds wealth in just circulation. So from an Islamic perspective, to wreck the climate and to hoard wealth are the same transgression. To provide energy in an unjust way is the same transgression. And that particular verse in the Holy Quran ends with the earth He spread out for all living creatures. So for all. So energy security for all is for us not a modern policy slogan, it is an ancient obligation. And security does not mean energy at any cost. Of course, it is energy. If we have energy secured through war, as we are seeing, unfortunately, in these days, or through someone else's darkness, it is not security at all. It is not peace at all. And there is no energy security without that premise of peace. Now, we know, of course, and many faith communities and indigenous communities have always said there's no peace without justice. And we know this premise, it is very familiar to us all. But let us then look at the root. What does our economy actually reward? It is the exact opposite. It is sad to say that we are living today in an immoral economy, one where it's easier to make money off money than off dignified work, where GDP goes up when we cut down forests and mine the ocean, where you get rich speculating on food prices while people starve, where a handful accumulate billions while entire communities sink into debt. And this system doesn't just damage ecosystems, it severs our very relationships our faiths teach us as sacred. And so for a lot of humanity, we're lived, split in two. We pray with our deepest held values on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in our houses of worship and our circles, our quiet moments of reflection, and then invest against them on Monday, and on every single day of the week, power our lives through our energy systems in the most immoral ways. And it's that contradiction that is costing us everything. So here's the conviction I kind of want to center around, which is that a just energy transition is not only an institutional and fiscal project, but it is a moral and cultural one. Faith communities are already amongst the largest non-stakeholders of land, capital, and trust on earth. We look at multi-century time horizons that this transition requires, and they are where spiritual imagination meets operational capacity to deliver energy security for all. And I'll give one example from my work. I'm an advisor to Greenpeace MENA on Islamic finance, and Islamic finance manages around $6 trillion in assets, heading for nearly $10 trillion by the end of this decade. So by scale alone, it is the largest ethical finance movement in the world. And its ethics are not aspirations. They're operational requirements for over billions of people governed by our spiritual principles. It is, no interest-bearing debt. There's no engine of forced growth that is prohibited. Wealth must circulate through an annual wealth tax. Financiers must share risk. All money must be tied to real economic activity. And, why we hold Islamic finance as a key spiritual pathway for energy security is that these are all the principles and values that we know that the UN, ARENA, and all energy systems say that we need for a just energy transition. And that is at the heart and center of the largest finance ethical movement in the world. And at the same time, it's just a path. It is up to us to walk the path, because I have to be honest with you, in our system today in Islamic finance, we still find, of course, funding of deforestation. We still find coal expansion across Southeast Asia. We still have a Sharia board certifying the destruction of the very creation that Sharia was sent to protect. So really, we're in this Kairos moment. We know that the transition will ultimately be decided by what we choose to see, whether it's the child studying by kerosene, whether it's the smoke settling on neighborhoods and that we'll never visit, whether it's the hundreds of billions of capital sitting quietly in accounts that could be liked and could become liked. And it's the centuries-old institutions standing in every village that we know are ready to carry it. And seeing the invisible has always been a vocation of faith. It is the oldest infrastructure humanity has for keeping promises to people we'll never meet. And energy security is exactly that kind of promise. And most of us and most of those it will serve are invisible to us today. We're separated in many ways by distance, by generations that are not yet to be born, but it's exactly up to us to make this work, the sacred work that is needed, whether it's in my case, in the Islamic finance industry, and trying to make the invisible visible, and trying to bring that into markets in the ways that we do what we know best, which is making that which we know around us that we cannot see the most important thing that is at the center of our lives. And that is what our energy systems need right now in that skill. So I'll end there, and I thank you all for listening as well today. And thank you again for the invitation. As-salama.
Yahweh, Tariq, for your kind and deep words. I really appreciate the reminder that there is a balance that we should respect if we are all to be healthy and living equitable, equality-driven lives. And to think about the fact that if we are producing energy in a way that harms others, that is actually a transgression against that balance. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I think that's true for many of our faiths, to view things in such a manner. At this time, I would like to give Seema Leibart 9 minutes to share her thoughts. Seema, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Within the broader theme of this discussion, I would like to talk about decolonizing the green transitions, particularly within Namibia, looking at it from the perspective of indigenous sovereignty and sacred memory. If we go to the next presentation, I would like to look at this whole green paradox of two futures, which is an idea that has well-intentioned climate policies that can inadvertently backfire and accelerate global warming. Then I also want to touch a little bit about the new maps of extraction, where global powers use the language of salvation in order to justify the exact same patterns of displacement and erasure. Then I also want to touch on new maps of exclusion and memory, which demonstrates that history isn't just forgotten, but it is also actively engineered out of sight. And then there are the new maps of sovereignty and sacred ecology, which take a different view that true sustainability requires the moral courage to look at history honestly, and also the spiritual humility to realize that humanity does not own the earth. Then there is the final thought that I want to touch on, which I believe the dead are not dead. And what is happening in Namibia, specifically at Shark Island, where these very ideas are being promoted, is that the dead at Shark Island are not silent, but they speak through the water and through those of us who remain. So in a nutshell, if we go to the next slide, I'm asking the question, what kind of future is being built if it still requires the sacrifice of indigenous peoples and indigenous and ancestral lands? Now, if we look at the green paradox in the next slide, we will see that this image visually splits the world into two competing realities connected by a machinery of global industry. In this image, you will see that on the left side, it is representing this green tech, tech narrative, where literally at the gateway where it's marked renewable energy shows this clean, orderly figures walking into this horizon, representing the long-term goals and idealized policies of government. If you look at the right-hand side, representing the immediate reaction to those policies, you will see the very same billowing smoke with a dark tunnel, which indicates fossil dependence, shows figures retreating into the earth in order to extract. At the center, you see interlocking mechanical gears where you are seeing holding up a grand institutional building representing governments and policymakers is a complex network of interlocking mechanical gears. These gears literally bind the green renewable energy to the smoking industrial landscape. It also illustrates that the two sides are not separated eras in time, but that they are mechanically linked. You cannot spin the gear of green transition without simultaneously grinding the gear of extraction and mining and fossil consumption. So you also see the observers in the foreground, which is a diverse group of people standing on a ridge, looking out at this massive system, and their position suggests humanity standing at a crossroads, watching a transition that is far more complicated, industrialized, and daunting than a simple switch to green hydrogen. Also in front of them, you will see a cracked forefront, which illustrates a dry, fractured earth beneath the observers, representing the immediate change in environmental degradation. So in summary, this illustration shows us that the road to this clean green paradise is paved by and is structurally dependent on the very heavy smoking extractive industry, and it challenges the viewer to look past this utopian marketing of this green industry, confronted by the messy industrial friction of the actual process. If we go to the map of the new maps of extraction, in this slide, while the green paradox deals with the economic and material contradictions of this transition, there is a much more painful and human and spiritual contradiction. The tendency of global powers to use the language of salvation to justify the exact same patterns of displacement and extraction that defined the colonial era. For very many centuries, colonial expansion relied on this doctrine of terra nullius, which basically implies that the land was empty and thus suitable for Lebensraum, ignoring the fact that societies had lived in harmony with it for millennia. So today, in a modern variation of this doctrine, what we are seeing is the sacrifice zone mentality, where vast deserts and ancestral coastlands are frequently mapped by distant governments as barren and ideal hotspots for massive wind farms. What we also see is an erasure of significance. So by viewing the land strictly through the lens of kilowatt hours, and we choose to ignore the sacred geography of ancestral graves and the living histories that are woven into this land. And so what the Nama people from whom I come have always pointed out is that a transition cannot be just if the methodologies of the past are not also made right. True climate justice, therefore, requires a fundamental shift in these power relationships. Now, if we go to the slide of new maps of sovereignty, that slide implies that there are 6 pillars on which we can transform climate justice from an abstract buzzword into a binding operational framework. 1, legally binding free prior informed consent. 2, recognition of indigenous sovereignty. 3, mandatory cumulative impact assessments. 4, independent indigenous-led monitoring. 5, the protection of sacred and genocide memorial landscapes. And 6, the inseparability of ecological and spiritual values. So yeah, finally, I think when we come to the next slide where I say the dead are not dead, what I mean here is that the crisis climate, the crisis unfolding in Nama territories reflects a much larger truth about global green transitions. If climate action continues to reproduce colonial patterns of extraction, then the transition itself becomes spiritually bankrupt, and the earth is not an empty land waiting to be conquered. The ocean is not vacant infrastructure. The desert is not disposable. The earth is a living relation to whom we owe responsibility, humility, and respect. Thank you so much.
Sima Yahweh, thanks for your very deep and powerful words. It's one thing that we move toward this green paradise, but you are correct. We also need to ensure that we are not creating that while stepping on the lives and the sacred lands of others, which does happen. And even when we do move to the more green side of things, there are still environmental impacts that perhaps aren't thought through until the new systems are put into place, whether it be the wind turbines now going near the ocean, and if they malfunction and fall and shatter, that material goes all the way along the coastline and affects all the water. So even our green paradise does have its contradictions. So that is a very powerful reminder. I appreciate that, those images, to bring that to a clear point. At this point, we will begin our Q&A session. So I just have a few reminders. Please click on the Q&A feature to open the window for question submissions. Also, if possible, please direct your question to a panelist so that we know who you would like to have answer it, whether it be all of them or just one of them. We have 10 minutes for questions and answers. We might go a little over, but we will do our best to answer at least 2 or 3 within the time. Panelists, I just ask that you be mindful, since we have a very short amount of time to answer the questions. We want to try to be as concise as possible and give our colleagues a chance to speak as well. I do have one question I would like to start us with. It's directed to the panel in general. I just have to scroll up here so I can find it. The question is, are our centers of faith addressing the spiritual aspects of who owns the energy grid, who controls the data, and who decides what counts as energy security and for whom? Would anybody like to start us off on that powerful question?
I can say very briefly that, from Green Faith's perspective, we see a small but growing number of religious and spiritual institutions doing this. As we speak now, our Green Faith Germany team is leading a tour with activists from the Gulf South in the United States who live in communities that have been ravaged by the petrochemical and fossil fuel industry, raising awareness about the costs of that system and calling on the German government to stop importing more fossil fuels from the United States. So it's not as large as it should be, but there are absolutely faith communities that are working on this. We need more of them.
Would any of our fellow panelists like to expand on his answer? I could also repeat the question. I'll do that for ourselves in the audience. Are our centers of faith addressing the spiritual aspects of who owns the energy grid, who controls the data, and who decides what counts as energy security and for whom?
Yeah, I'll also add, I think onto Fletcher, there is definitely a growing movement, and I think the way I'd like to describe that movement is that we're starting to stop asking faith communities to only bless the transition, and we're starting to see faith communities actually build the transition with their land, their capital, their trust, their patience. I think it's been very interesting to see different experiments, in Southeast Asia and Africa and the US around sort of a more moral imagination view of, what are the economics behind our energy transition. Fletcher is doing obviously incredible work there. And the example I gave around Islamic finance is one that it's a $6 trillion experiment in exactly that question. But I will say the one thing that I think is still the sticking point, and it's one that's been on everyone's probably tongues over the last week, has been this has all changed because of AI as well. I think that is also a game changer. And I think Pope Leo is very beautifully framed. I think the deeper challenges around the who owns question that I think was maybe a little bit more simpler a couple of years ago for us to navigate, and today is far more murky. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do to really look at how we navigate that as faith communities.
Thank you so much for sharing. Would our last two panelists like to jump in on that? I'm still waiting for more questions from my chat box. So if we want to expand on that, I think it's a really great idea.
Yes, maybe I can add from our side. I think there is indeed a growing movement to, the narrative is always that energy is brought for the sake of development. And in Namibia particularly, I think among the Nama communities and Namibia in general, we are starting to see people questioning, but at what cost? At what cost is this coming, and how do we address the historical injustices that are linked to, to all these developments? So yes, it's a very slow movement in Namibia, but I think that there are voices that are starting to bring the discussion beyond the economics into the spiritual realm and into the connectedness to land and to the connectedness to your inner human being and connectedness to ancestral spirit. So definitely, I'm also seeing that people are asking, but who owns the narrative? And on whose land is this being done? And how was this land lost? And at what cost was this land lost? And what did it do, this loss, what did it do to our humanity? So in that sense, I think there is a growing movement.
Excellent. Simo, we do have one question directed to you. So since you are speaking, I will just have you kind of elaborate a bit on this question. How can faith communities help make right the path to support a just transition? What would you like other faith traditions to do?
I think that is what I just answered in a way, because when we are talking about energy transitions, we only see the economics of it, and we don't see at what cost it comes. And particularly in the case of Namibia, what is happening in Namibia is so interlocked with German colonial history that is a very violent history, and which impacts are still felt today through generations. It is on that same land where these developments are being pursued. It is on that same land that people were dispossessed, that people were murdered, not only murdered, but that genocides took place. It is on that same land where mass graves exist. And we would not exist as a Nama people if it was not for those people who survived this extreme violence and therefore we owe an obligation to those who made it possible for us to live. And I believe that it is because their voices speak to us that we can speak today. And if anything should happen, it should be in their honor. And so, yeah, that is what I think.
In their honor. That's beautiful. I do have a question for the general panel, and I'm going to ask Cassie to start. And the question is, are any of you looking at bringing free energy forward, or is this still too risky to discuss?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, it'll be very nice around the world if we have a free energy forward and bring it to everyone else. The accessibility of energy as it is. I mean, I have a couple of things to say with regards to that, because the narrative around energy is largely about development and capital and all that. So we don't have a narrative that speaks otherwise. But I'd like to think that just as politics works by division and compassion and justice should work by multiplication, I would like to think that energy, we need to create a network of energy that spreads compassion, spreads justice, and the well-being of, especially in terms of our communities, the well-being of the least among us. And if we begin that kind of energy discussion and narrative, that will somehow or other shift the narrative, the current narrative that focuses energy on development and more growth, to a kind of narrative energy discussion that focuses on spreading compassion and justice and all that. So I'm beginning to think that maybe in terms of moving the free energy forward, we need to change the narrative. Thank you.
That itself is no easy task. Changing the narrative is extremely important, but that will take many voices to do so. I have another question that is geared toward the general panel, and it is, can we share the local work that we are doing with the work that you are doing? And if so, how might we do this? I don't have any more detailed information to go with that question. I assume they're talking about networking and how we can get our organizations and our work more interconnected for more bang, right? For more narrative changing.
I know that we would love to connect as we move towards looking at some kind of global just energy transition, renewable energy celebration, mobilization next year. We would love to connect with fellow travelers who are interested in that, and perhaps the webinar organizers can share our contact information.
One more quick question. I'll give up some of my time at the end because I think it's important. But we have a question. How can faith communities emphasize our higher spiritual purpose to refine our character, apply justice, live with humility and moderation?
Yes, my final thoughts, ultimately, I think what we are all saying, we are issuing a challenge to the world's moral conscience. Climate change is a physical crisis, but its roots are spiritual, born from a system that believes that it can exploit the world and its people without consequence. And what we are saying is that true sustainability requires the moral courage to look at history honestly, the legal courage to honor indigenous sovereignty, and the spiritual humility to realize that humanity does not own the earth. We are answerable to it and to the ancestors who rest within it. I think that is the ultimate message for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, panelists. They're really hoping that we can move forward because we want to give you all a chance to have your final thoughts, your conclusory remarks. So at this point, we're going to start with Tarek. We're going to give you a chance to do your concluding remarks.
Yes, thank you. I'll maybe just conclude also with I think the question of risk, is free energy too risky to discuss? I think it's an interesting one because I think the question is who is threatened by energy that can't be owned? And if we answer that, I think we understand the politics of the whole transition. I think if we understand the politics of the whole transition, I think then we are geared towards, as faith communities and those that have maybe a moral obligation, which we work towards, of where we put our efforts in. We know that the scarcity that we're working with isn't physical. And we know that the just transition is not swapping the fuel in the same machine. That it is really all of us to go into this deeper invitation to sufficiency, which is what I take the question of. We know that the sun rises on everyone, and I think our spiritual task is to build an economy that finally does the same. And we know when we're in contradiction to that, our hearts know, our souls know, and our communities know.
Very powerful. That's very true. And the sun does rise for us all. It heats us all. Oh, we are all in this together. At this point, I do want to give our quiet one, Cassie. I want to give you a chance to give your conclusory thoughts.
Simply to say that, the world is in need of an energy transition, but also the world need a transition of heart, and it's not only about energy. And while that is the topic of discussion today, it's about how we look at ourselves as a human species in the vastness of our universe. And I mean, traditions of spirituality all across the world, indigenous understanding and experiences of spirituality. And I'm quite taken aback. I mean, I'm taken, I mean, very literally. The First Nations people of Australia, what they call the dream. And so what they do is that the understanding of the dream is purely holding the universe in balance. And that has offended the British so much that they attempted to wipe them out. Ever since the colonial days, up until the 1960s, the Aborigines of Australia were regarded as flora and fauna and printed in the leaflet. So I think it's more. I think it's the discussion about energy is great, but I think it's a question about our humanity and who we are at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your words. I know we have two more panelists, so let's give Fletcher a chance to give his final thought.
Thanks so much. And perhaps this stands on the shoulders of what my fellow panelists have said before, and tries to bring together the cosmovision and the values with the important opportunity and duty that religious communities have. So all of us on this webinar know about the profound threat that the climate crisis represents. And fossil fuels and the extractive mindset behind them are the root cause of that crisis. And so we stand at a place in human history where an energy transition is necessary. And I mean that both on the spiritual and on the material levels. And so the question before us, I think, is, can we link those two endeavors together? And can we do that in a better way than it has been done previously? There are examples of renewable energy projects that have been done in a profoundly ethical manner that represent the kinds of values that we've been speaking about. And I think it's important for religious communities to learn about those, to learn how to speak to what they represent and to advocate for them publicly, because there are extraordinarily powerful interests that will have a different vision. And this will be a struggle of different worldviews. So I think that we have both the opportunity and the spiritual moral obligation to become better able to speak out in public and to represent what our traditions teach, which is a way of peace and of harmony and of unity and of awe and gratitude for a power much greater than ourselves. And that we have all been blessed. The sun has not gone on strike. The wind is not sitting on the sidelines. These ancient, everlasting powers are there. And it is our job to align our values and to receive that gift in a way that nurtures and supports life. So let's get after it as religious communities, and let's do our job as well as we can.
Thank you so much. I feel so empowered now, and I want to start a PR campaign and all these amazing earth-friendly energy producing methods that people have that really aren't given enough media attention. I think that's going to take all of our efforts to get those out there. They do exist, but we do need to change the narrative, and that's one way we can do it. Simple way. I mean, TikTok is powerful. We can share whatever tidbits on there. And maybe it'll catch some influencer's eye and get it out there. You never know. At this point in time, I would like to give Seema a chance to give her final thoughts.
Yes, my final thoughts, ultimately, I think what we are all saying, we are issuing a challenge to the world's moral conscience. Climate change is a physical crisis, but its roots are spiritual, born from a system that believes that it can exploit the world and its people without consequence. And what we are saying is that true sustainability requires the moral courage to look at history honestly, the legal courage to honor indigenous sovereignty, and the spiritual humility to realize that humanity does not own the earth. We are answerable to it and to the ancestors who rest within it. I think that is the ultimate message for me. Thank you.
So we have some powerful reminders that were shared with us today. Many of our faiths, we do honor the earth. We do see her as this beautiful planet that cares for us, and that we should have that reciprocity back. We've mentioned the fact that humanity does not own the earth. We've mentioned the fact that the sun and the various elements continue to assist humanity. We know perhaps we should do the same thing back. Perhaps we all need to work together to find ways to highlight the beautiful activities that have been done to help create positive and useful energy resources that wouldn't hurt people or the earth or various ecosystems. We've also reminded ourselves that our faiths connect us to the cosmos. And that's an ecology in and of itself, which we could also find within. So this is all an amazing topic, this energy topic and the spirituality behind it. And I hope that our attendees were able to take a piece of wisdom with them so that, next time they turn on a light switch, they think about the invisible thing behind it. What's going on? How were you able to do that? What energy did you have available to do it? How was the energy created? Was it created through an extractive energy system? All those things that we just take for granted. I have my Zoom, I have my computer. I'm very fortunate I have all these things, but at the same time, it is so easy to not think about where those things come from and all the consequences of me turning on that light or using my computer or, having my Zoom webinars with my intelligent colleagues. But at this time, I would like to thank the G20 Interfaith Forum and the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation for hosting this webinar. I would also like to express my deepest gratitude to our panelists who have assisted us in developing a deeper understanding of the spiritual aspects of creating pathways to energy security for all. Lastly, I would like to thank our attendees who made the conscious effort to attend today. And done it, that is all. Thank you.